Hola a todos, bienvenidos al Global Game Jam 2025. Mi nombre es Luis León, yo formo parte del equipo de organización de este evento. Entonces, el día de hoy tenemos a Jarory, quien ha trabajado como diseñador narrativo en Star Wars, en el último que salió de la serie de Jedi. Entonces, él nos va a estar hablando un poco sobre su trabajo en ese videojuego, así como en otros proyectos que ha realizado, también como en roles más técnicos, entre otras cuestiones. Así que primero vamos a empezar un poco con su trasfondo y a partir de ahora vamos a estar hablando en inglés. Así que probablemente eso se va a subtitular y si no, pues bueno, aquí va a quedar grabado para futuras ocasiones. Así que we're going to start in English right now, Jerry. So, well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to interview you. So, could you tell us a little about yourself, like some of the work you have done, like what's your background, maybe? And
Sure.
very
Yeah.
much for being here.
I'll start by saying I was able to follow half of that in Spanish, which I'm really proud of. I've been practicing my Spanish, so Puerto Rican and Black game developer, but I haven't learned Spanish since I was young because I grew up in New York City. So, didn't really need it in the States. So, been working on learning it. So I'm very proud that I was able to follow that. But as far as my background in the industry goes, I have a weird path how I got into games. I actually have an anthropology degree and a creative writing minor. I was going to grad school to do like a PhD in that, and then I decided I hated my PhD, so I dropped out. I was looking for something to do with my life, so I started picking up how to code. I was working like a dead-end programming job a year later that I really hated. So I was like, okay, I learned to code. There'll be something cooler I can do with it. And I was watching Extra Credits, the YouTube series, and they were like, oh, you can go to school for games. So I had thought about, I had entertained the idea. I was already learning Unity for doing like AR apps via code. So I was like, okay, maybe I can take this Unity stuff and do games with it. And I was like, let me just see if there's something nearby. So the number 2 at the time, now number 1 program for game development at the master's level in America happened to be an hour away from where I was living. That is University of Central Florida in Orlando. So I was like, sure, let's go. I'll apply. If I get in, it's like a sign that it's what I'm supposed to be doing. So I got my master's degree from there. And then my first job I started at was with EA Tiburon on Madden. So we were working on I was embedded into the narrative team as a technical designer. So I wasn't doing the narrative work myself, but I was doing all the tools for the narrative team. So there's a pipeline to get the text from the tool they have called Journey, which is actually used for FIFA, that we ended up adopting for Madden purposes. But it's where they do the scripting and or not scripting, but like they write the text scripts. And my job was to make the pipeline that took that text and put it in Engine with like the press of a button. So I did a lot of tooling for them there. From there, that contract ended. I moved to Chicago to work on casino gaming as a programmer. When COVID hit, actually. So COVID struck, and that was unfortunate because I lost my job as a consequence of that, and I was kind of living on unemployment for a bit. But stroke of luck, one of the alumni at my university happened to be opening on Marvel Strike Force, so I took that job. But I still really wanted to do narrative, so I kept bothering them to let me sit in on the narrative meeting, be in the room with the narrative design team. Even though I was hired as a technical designer. Eventually that led to me getting my first narrative job on Star Wars, where I did a lot of work on Jedi Survivor. I then moved over to Housemarque as a narrative designer. And now I run my own studio called Coquito Games, where I also contract out a little bit of my work with another company called Lunacy, where I serve as their lead narrative designer as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. That's very interesting. A lot of things you have talked upon. I would like the first actual question would be like, how would you define narrative design to the people who are watching this?
Ooh.
And then we can get into the more of technical stuff or how your background has helped you working on that area.
Sure. So narrative design is explicitly not a writing job. I have to tell people this a lot. If you want to be a games writer, it's a very different career path. A narrative designer is kind of a hybrid between a regular traditional gameplay designer and like a story editor would probably be a better way to put it. So a lot of what I do, depending on in different roles, like on Star Wars, a lot of what I did was implementation. So I did a lot of like, okay, we have all the dialogue. Someone needs to set up the systems to play the dialogue at the right time. And then I would work with the level designer and the writer to like get the timing right or to change the words. Because maybe the writer wrote this a little too long, so it overlaps with the next line of dialogue. And so we have to cut it down. And so a lot of it's timing and implementation for a narrative designer. As you get higher in the ranks as a narrative designer to senior and lead roles, and even narrative director, you start doing a lot more of the creative, high level, like planning. So as a lead on Lunacy's project, I'm basically responsible for story beats, in addition to technical systems, in addition to implementation. I do a lot of the like, okay, we need to hit this beat here, so that this pays off later over here and things like that. And as a narrative director, of course, you're responsible for the high level vision of the story, not necessarily the minor details. And that's really important because I think a lot of people think, oh, I want to be a director and get to tell my story. But a lot of times you're not doing the writing when you get to that level. So that's kind of the various tiers of narrative design.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That introduction. I do think a lot of people can get confused, but I think it's very normal since all of these job titles or specializations are very recent, video games in general are very recent, like in human history. So a lot of things, a lot of job titles maybe are still being created, like as we go along the way. So. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So I think my next question is actually one I just wrote down because I think it's very interesting, given that background you told us about. Well, how did your creative writing minor help you in your job? Because you say you got first into more of a technical role, and then you actually got into this narrative side, but how did that experience or that background of yours shape your work?
Well, I think as a designer, the best advice I ever got was that you are designing experiences, therefore you should experience things. That's the best way to design. So having not a traditional games degree first was really helpful for me because what it gave me was a lot of insight into other parts of life. As a writer, I'm also an observer of life, and as an anthropologist, I'm an observer of life. So those two things really trained me in how to look at the world around me and how to interpret it through a creative lens. So my specialization was poetry, and I would comment a lot on both my internal world, but also the world around me. And as I transitioned into game development and into design, eventually I took that same skill set of looking at the world and translating it into a creative poem instead of translating it into a creative game. Different medium, same idea. And when I became a narrative designer, I took the training I had as a creative writer in terms of story construction and progression, pacing, things like that. And that really helped inform how I look at narrative design as well.
Yeah, I think it's very valuable that you tell us all of these things because that's something I usually tell to younger game developers that are trying to get into this, that first and foremost, like they have to experience other things beyond games. So they can actually get those things into games because it can make for a more enriching experience. So that's great to hear also from you. Uh,
You know,
uh,
the example I was given when I was learning how to build games was actually Will Wright. Apparently, when he built The Sims, he was inspired by watching his daughter play with dolls. So, like just looking at something totally unrelated to games, just like a child playing Dollhouse, and I was like, I can make a video game with this same engagement style.
yes, that's very important to do. So, well, thank you for that first part of this question.
Okay.
So well, getting more into Star Wars. I mean, you already told us like how you got into that. Well, but I have a more like I don't know if it's a more technical question at that, but I think it's very important and it can be very interesting to the people who are watching or hearing this.
Sure.
So, how was it working inside the framework of not only a sequel to another game, but having to work inside the margins of an established franchise? Because maybe,
Oh.
yeah, because maybe if we a lot of people who like to write, and we will, well, I mean, we like to think it's more of a, oh, I'm going to write about my personal experience, and well, it can get shoehorned into those things. We can write inside those margins, but I mean, I think or I guess you had to. How do I say this? You had to be careful about. Oh, this is like Star Wars, and I. Even in a more narrative design role, like I guess you had to I'm missing.
Yeah, I see what you're getting at.
Yeah.
There are more limitations working
Yeah.
with an established IP. Working on Star Wars, Lucasfilms is incredibly precious with their IP, so they have a lot of say in what happens and what doesn't happen. There's a lot of ideas that get floated by the team where they're like, "Oh, maybe we'll try this," and then Lucasfilm is like, "No, can't let you do that." And sometimes it's because it doesn't fit the established canon. So, an example, in Jedi Survivor, in the first level, when you get to the meat factory area, you unlock an ability called Force Confusion, which allows Cal to turn an enemy into an ally temporarily. Now, initially, we wanted this to be Jedi Mind Trick, but canonically, the way Jedi Mind Trick is used is never in a combat sense. And so it had to be a different ability. It could not be Jedi Mind Trick. It had to be called something else, and that's why it's called Force Confusion instead. Like little details like that, they get really, they care about that a lot, because it's how it affects the brand and the image as a whole and all of that. And so, we still got the ability in game, but we couldn't use the Jedi Mind Trick label for that ability. There are other examples of like content that was cut that I can't talk about that Lucas said, hey, we don't want you guys doing this. Part of it was because another Wars product was doing that same thing somewhere else. So they didn't want two products doing the same thing, story-wise. So that happens a lot where like an IP holder like Star Wars or Marvel will have multiple projects at once. And if one project is doing something, then another project can't do the same thing. That happens quite frequently.
Okay, so did you actually have an experience or have you heard about an experience where you actually convinced them to write something a certain way, or does not, not happen at all?
On Star Wars, but on Marvel Strike Force, we did this quite a lot. What we would do when we were setting up characters, we would do their animations and kind of come up with the story and their abilities and all of that. And I remember one time we were working on Moon Knight, I think it was, and we convinced the Marvel stakeholders that like the set of animations we were going to use for Moon Knight was more fitting for his kind of visceral style of combat than some of the others ones. We also did something similar with Multiple Man. There was a VFX that we hadn't even tried out yet, and so we were like, okay, these VFX are going to sell multiple man splitting off into multiple people kind of thing. And he was actually one of the favorite characters I worked on entirely. Initially, they wanted to keep it streamlined and simple, but we convinced them to let us like experiment with it a little bit.
Okay, that's very interesting as well. So, taking into account the background you had in more technical roles, how do you think that has changed the way you approach narrative in general?
Ooh. I am a lot more conscious of how much my narrative beats cost because I can code. So, like, a simple example: 2 characters kiss, right? Now, you would think this is simple, but for an animation animator, that's really complicated. You have to get 2 skeletal meshes to sync up with each other, and then IK them together, and there's a whole list of things that happen. You have to code this as unique sequence that happens under certain conditions, and then you have to make the transition in and out of the kissing sequence. Or if it's in real time, what happens if the player tries to move during the kiss? You have to compensate for that. Right? There's like so many variables that happen with just a simple kissing sequence. And when I write now, I'm very conscious of how much each action costs on a code. So I try to write in a way that is more reusable and more systemic. And I didn't used to write that way before. When I'm designing systems and narrative systems, I try to make everything like I avoid one-off things because one-off things are expensive. So I try to make things more reusable so that we can get a lot more mileage and a lot more content out.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. I have also had a lot of experiences like that. So there's a programmer I worked with that told us pretty much the same thing. Like, hey, let's try to avoid one-off scenarios because then they are very hard to actually. Well, we can code them, but it's going to take a lot of time to code that thing instead of like reusing certain things. So I think it's a very interesting way also to approach narrative. I mean, I have had a lot of experiences like that, but I hadn't made them conscious. Like,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very good tip or hint.
With narrative, it's tricky because you want to do things, but the minute you write something that doesn't exist already, you're asking, you're creating work for other departments, and so like gameplay systems that narrative requires, you want to make sure that you're using whatever gameplay systems already exist. So, for example, if a character can't fly, and you want him to fly for a segment, I would go talk to a game designer and say, hey, can we make fly an ability in the game? And if so, when do we unlock it so we know where we can place it in the story? One example. And if they come back with no, because gameplay reasons this breaks this, and this, then we cut the flying scene and we do something else. Maybe we just make him do like a leap of faith jump instead, so that he like jumps over a big chasm and like barely makes it, right? Just a simple example.
Okay, so well, this is going to be like 2 questions in one. So, how has working on AAA shaped the way you approach like more independent projects, and vice versa? Like, what do you think working on independent projects can shape the way you approach working at AAA studios?
I see. So, I think working on AAA has given me a lot more systemic approaches to my production process as an indie developer. When I was doing like Star Wars, there's always like a pipeline for everything, right? And same with Marvel and same with Housemarque. Everything has like a process. And so now as coming into indie development, I bring a lot of that process with me, so I know exactly how to like mark and measure when things are done and complete and get things from point A to point B. But on the flip side of that, indies don't need as much, like, I don't know if they don't need as much process, but I think they need a lot more room for creativity that process sometimes doesn't allow. And so finding the balance between process and creativity and how to let them complement each other has been the biggest learning curve that I've had coming into the indie space. And I think coming from indie, if I were to go back to AAA, I'd bring a lot more of like creative liberties to teams under me that maybe I didn't have before. I think those are probably the big trade-offs.
Okay, so getting more back into like the job about going into narrative design, what would you tell like aspiring narrative designers or developers like how they should maybe start working their maybe portfolio or maybe like like what would be like an ideal career path for them if they want to get into narrative design?
So for every designer, I give this piece of advice, which is build games, right? The more big games you build, the more your portfolio shines and the better it'll be. For narrative design specifically, you can't code. I'm not going to say go learn to code because that is its own process. If you can code, you're already a step ahead. But if you can't code, learn how to make games in Twine. That's a starting place. You can build out a couple of Twine games to show that you understand how to tell nonlinear stories. You're leaps and bounds ahead of the rest of the pack when it comes to applying for jobs. And then if you can code, I'd recommend building things in Unity at least, maybe Unreal if possible, although Unreal is its own kind of monster, and learning different tools. So Artisy, Arcweave, Ink, Fungus, these are all narrative design tools that are used in conjunction with various engines like Unity and Unreal. And so I would start learning those tools and building games with those tools to show that you understand how to tell stories, but also how to build systems.
Yeah, I think that and they are very great tools, and so yeah, that's a very great advice for game developers out there. So, well, I don't know, how are you like in terms of time? Do we have like?
Yeah, we've got time.
Okay, so maybe like a little couple of extra questions that I think can be very interesting and can give like further material for the people listening to this. But what are some of the games that you have maybe played in recent years that you go, oh, those are very great games in terms of narrative? Or
I just finished Metaphor Refantasio, and that game is fantastic, and it has some really great narrative moments and narrative systems that I think a player can study from. On a AAA level, I do believe like the Spider-Man games by Insomniac have really great ambient narrative systems for you to look at, particularly like passerby conversations and side conversations that are really well done in that game. On a more indie scale, I would say, what is it called? Not Wormwood. It's a pop-up game that's a tactics game. Wildermyth. That game is fantastic when it comes to narrative systems from an indie perspective. It does a lot of procedural narrative, which is a complicated beast, but if you can crack it, you've got yourself a wonderful game. Obviously, Hades has a fantastic narrative system. If you have a 600-person team and a multi-million-dollar budget, then by all means look at Baldur's Gate 3. But like, I love Baldur's Gate 3. Don't get me wrong, but that you're not making that kind of game without a huge team and a lot of time and money. So, you know, I would actually games like Baldur's Gate 3, The Last of Us, even Ghost of Tsushima are really big budget games that have great narrative systems that are hard to replicate without the same level of resources. So I would advise against looking at games like that, actually. I would focus more on even Metaphor, as much as I love that game, is a huge budget game. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt. But there are a lot of interesting one in Fire Emblem 3 Houses, which I played when it first came out. And the way they do static images in their conversations is pretty interesting. What they'll do, instead of having a prop, like a character pick up a prop to save on animation and resources, they'll just show the prop as a PNG in between the two speakers. And that kind of thing can get a lot of mileage for very little effort. So those kind of cheats are worth looking at, even in big budget games, because three houses in particular is huge in scope, so they had to cut a lot of corners in terms of what systems they could use narratively.
Yeah, I think they are very great recommendations. I would add that yes, I think it's very like fruitful to look at independent games as you're starting out, but then you can see a lot of things that AAA is doing that I think are very ingenious, mostly because they have more resources. But talking about Spider-Man, I think there's this one thing I really like about how they construct the conversations that has become very common, but the first time I saw it was like, wow, I hadn't thought about that, or maybe I had thought about that, and they are starting to implement it. Is that when you are like in the middle of a conversation with a character, maybe on a phone call, and then you get into like combat scenario.
Like, can I call you right back?
Yes, exactly, and then you return to that phone call, and it's as I was saying, and then they pick up on the last dialogue.
We actually built a system doing that at Housemark. I was like, it was because I played Spider-Man. I was like, hey, we have a lot of because Housemark is got a lot of combat, so a lot of times you might be mid conversation, have to leave combat and come back. And so I was like, hey, maybe we should compensate for that.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, we're maybe approaching a wrap up. So I don't know if there's more things you would like to tell the audience that maybe you find very important, or maybe some tips along the way.
Yeah. My two things I think I wish I had known when I was starting out. The first one is that it's a hard road, and it's okay if you're not getting where you want to be right away. In fact, sometimes getting your foot in the door is more important than getting the job that you want right away. So if you're not getting a narrative design role, but maybe you're qualified for a producer role, get that production job, get in the door, and move laterally. That being said, don't get too good as a producer, because then you're going to be shoehorned into being a producer, which is kind of what happened to me. I was a tech designer for half my career because I kept doing tech design and being good at it. So I had to fight to get into narrative, and that was kind of an uphill battle. The better I got as a tech designer. So get your foot in the door, but make sure you make it very clear what your intentions are during the interview. Like, hey, I'll take this producer job, but I eventually want to be narrative designer, and I want to get over there. How can we make that happen, right? And be honest during the interview. You may not get the job, and that's okay, but it's better that you work at a place that's willing to work with you than a place that is going to use you. And that's the other thing that I wish I had learned early on. It's okay. Like, companies are companies, right? And so it's okay to put yourself before the company, because at the end of the day, you have to live with your life choices, not the company.
Yeah, that's very great advice. I second that. So, well, are there any social media links you would like to leave us? Or?
I'm on Blue Sky, and that's under my Twitter handle as well. I don't use Twitter though, so I'm mostly on Blue Sky. It's Jarory, Jarory, which is kind of a pun on my name. So forgive the mid 2000s emo in the middle of there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you can follow me there on Blue Sky. You can. I do have an Instagram, but I don't use it. So I would just recommend following me on Blue Sky. You can connect with me on LinkedIn as well. My name should be somewhere in the title of this video. I'm the only one with my name, so it should be very easy to find me. Just send me a message so I know how you found me.
Okay, thank you very much. So, any other like commercial, like maybe about a game you're working on, like Coquito Games, or?
So Coquito Games, we're working on 2 projects. One of them has a Steam page live right now. It's called What's a King to a God. It's a game where you play as a hero who has overthrown God, and now you have to take over the job and try not to get overthrown yourself. And then the other one is a project near and dear to my heart called Concrete Rose, which is a hip-hop JRPG that we're developing. We don't have a lot of details on that yet, but stay tuned for more.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you should definitely, like the audience, you should check out these projects. I think they also look very interesting. So, well, that would be about it. So, thank you very much again, Jarory, for this time.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, so well, that's about it. To the people watching this, thank you very much. I'm going to switch back to Spanish a little bit. Gracias por escuchar esto y vamos a tener más contenidos en el marco del Global Game Jam 2025, así que estén al pendiente. Si cualquier cosa, pues pueden escribirle a Jarory o a mí. Y pues nada, cuídense, disfruten y hagan juegos. Bye.